Welcome everyone to the Caxton Legal Centre webinar today on the topic of health justice partnerships, possibilities for Queensland. I will be your facilitator for today's session and my name is Anne-Louise McCauley. One of my roles in Queensland Health is acting as the Metro South Health Partnership Coordinator for the Older Persons Advocacy and Legal Service, or OPALS, which is a HJP that you'll also hear a little bit more about. So I'm really keen on this topic. But before we start, on behalf of us all here, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations peoples who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we are watching this webinar today, whether across this state of Queensland, wherever you are, or interstate. We recognise their ongoing connection to the land, waters and community of the traditional custodians and pay respect to our elders past, present and emerging. We also recognise, respect and celebrate the cultural distinctions of the First Nations people and value their rich and positive contribution to Queensland and to broader Australian society. With respect, we strive to achieve justice and inclusion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Thank you, everyone. Just to note that we won't be having verbal comments from people today and questions. So if you want and have any questions that you'd like to add into the chat session, please enter these at any point of time into that chat box and we'll address them at the end of this session. Thank you. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for today's session. Welcome, Tessa Boyd-Kane. Tessa is the CEO of Health Justice Australia, a national centre of excellence for health justice partnerships, supporting the expansion and effectiveness of collaborating services. Thank you, Tessa. Hile Imo is a senior solicitor with the Older Persons Advocacy and Legal Service within Caxton Legal Centre. And Fiona, welcome. Fiona Trad is an advanced social worker and clinical team leader at the Princess Alexandra Hospital based within Metro South Health. So welcome everyone. Now, first question, Tessa, tell us a little bit about health justice partnerships for anyone who may not know what they are and when and how did they emerge in Australia?
Thanks, Anne-Louise. Terrific to be joining you all from Gadigal land here in Sydney, and I extend my acknowledgement of country also. So Health Justice Partnership is a collaborative service model that embeds legal help into healthcare teams and settings to help people accessing those services with the problems in their life that have legal solutions. So before we get into what that looks like, it's really a response to two bodies of evidence. The first is what we know about the social determinants of health, which demonstrated how the factors of people's life affect our health, from where we're born to how we grow up, our access to education, the adequacy of our income, housing, and importantly, how we age. So very clear evidence from the social determinants of health about the non-medical factors that affect our health. Alongside that, and through a similar period, there's been a body of evidence emerging about access to justice, which has identified that most people in their lives will experience multiple legal problems, which they don't necessarily identify as legal problems. They don't necessarily seek legal help for those problems, but they often raise them in a setting of trust. And in the formal architecture of our services, healthcare settings are a likely place where people raise these legal problems. And when we're talking about justice in this context, we're not necessarily thinking about interaction with the police or the courts or prisons. We're thinking about everyday stuff of life that has legal solutions. So credit and debt, housing instability, employment insecurity, family law issues. So taken together, these two bodies of evidence point to the multiple intersecting factors that drive or exacerbate poor health. And it was really in response to this evidence that health and legal practitioners realised that they needed to start working differently if they were going to respond effectively to the complex, so the multiple and intersecting health and legal problems in the lives of the people they serve. So from around 2012 in Australia, we saw a number of community legal sector practitioners investigating collaborative ways of providing legal help. And here they were looking at international models, and then they were bringing those lessons back and piloting those in their services in the Australian context. And that was the first examples or the first sort of documented examples of health justice partnership. In 2015, we saw the first Commonwealth funding come into this space. In 2016, Health Justice Australia was established, and we were really established by these pioneering practitioners to help support and drive the effectiveness of their work. So as a National Centre of Excellence, we work by building the evidence base about this way of working. What is it? Who is it seeing? What difference is it making? Evaluation and other kind of research questions. We work directly with practitioners to support their ability to collaborate, to work in partnership in response to complexity. And we connect the lessons of evidence, both from research and from practice, into policy advocacy to make sure that our policy settings and our funding decisions enable this way of working together. And we're now working with over 100 collaborations between health and legal assistance services across Australia. So we see them in every state and territory now. And interestingly for your health audience, we see them in every part of the health system, from hospitals to community health. And that includes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled health services and child and maternal health services. But it also includes community service settings that we wouldn't necessarily think about as health, but that do have that trust of people who might be vulnerable to legal needs. So for example, early childhood centres are another location where we've seen this model emerging. On the legal partner side, this work is mostly done by publicly funded community legal services. So that might be your community legal centres like Caxton, your Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services, or family violence prevention legal services, or legal aid organisations. Health Justice Partnership is not necessarily a good fit for pro bono legal help from private firms, although there are exceptions to that, and I'm really happy to explore that further in terms of what makes a good legal partner. But just to finish, it's really important to think about health justice partnership not as a single model of practice, but as a collaborative approach. So we've mapped at least 4 different ways that health justice partnerships operate on the ground. And really that allows them to respond to very different community needs across the country. So what works in southeast Brisbane might be very different from what works in Alice Springs. The services that exist to partner might be different. The capacity and the capability to partner might be different. So we've identified the ways that working together between health and legal services, what that can look like and what difference that can make. But we're also drawing really heavily on some of the best thinking around place-based responses to complex community need.
Thank you, Tessa. I think that's a great summary. And I think what it probably points out is that it is based on the very broad conceptualization of health too, that it's not just around, you know, hospital and health services, although of course it can be, but it takes into that larger, and, you know, really it's as broad as you can make it, and thinking about new initiatives is part of this whole process. So, you know, that's really encouraging, but I think too, it's probably a really lovely segue across to you, Tile, to look at, you know, what in fact was the OPALS Health Justice Partnership, and then thinking of that as an example and telling us how that was titrated.
Thanks, Anne-Louise. And I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, particularly of where I'm presenting from, the Turrbal and Yagara people. And just to, I guess, piggyback on some of Tessa's comments, I think that First Nations people's cultures have always included traditions of collaboration and storytelling and understanding of systems that in many ways health justice partnerships are emulating and can learn from as well. And health justice partnerships have proven themselves to be a great model for assisting people who are experiencing or at risk of domestic and family violence. And so our service, OPALS, or the Older Persons Advocacy and Legal Service, is a service that responds to elder abuse as a very specific form of domestic and family violence. And so we hope that it would follow that same trajectory. Our Health Justice Partnership is a partnership between Caxton Legal Centre and Metro South Health. And Caxton Legal Centre's vision and its strategic plan is for a just and inclusive Queensland. Metro South Health's vision and its strategic plan is health and well-being for all in the community. So you can already tell that there's an overlap there in terms of the organisation's overarching vision for health and justice equity. The creation and implementation of OPALS was very collaborative. Before I started in OPALS, I'm aware that there were lots of meetings with different stakeholders, many of whom are part of our steering committee now, for initial discussions and also for buy-in from those different key stakeholders about how OPALS might work. And therefore, OPALS was very much co-designed and developed by both organisations. And in the end, we adopted the model that we think is best practice in terms of responding to elder abuse, and that's the integrated lawyer and social work model, which Caxton's been delivering in the form of its seniors legal and support service for over 15 years. And that model recognises the intersectionality and compounding nature of elder abuse, and opens up, the legal and social support options and interventions that are available for older people to choose from. But in a nutshell, OPALS basically consists of lawyers employed by Caxton who are co-located and work within Metro South Health hospitals, and a community social worker who is based at Caxton. In our first year, we worked primarily from Princess Alexandra Hospital, but we've since expanded to Logan, Redlands, and Kiwi 2 hospitals. So the lawyer works and integrates themselves within the social work department at each hospital, and we work with patients who are generally referred by the hospital social workers. And then once that patient is discharged, the hospital social worker can provide a warm handover to the OPALS community social worker, but our community social worker can also accept referrals from community health services, so like your nurse navigators and community nurses, transition care and allied health workers in the community. So that's OPALS.
Well, you mentioned the concept of warm handover. Would you like to explain, because a lot of people may not be aware of what a warm handover is, but why is it important in this particular model?
I think it's that intersectionality and compounding issues that older people might be experiencing, the multiple legal issues that they might be facing. And so the hospital social worker might have identified some of those, and they can provide that information to the community social worker, who can then pick up where the hospital social workers left off, and continue that work to connect that person with social supports or other legal services that they might be entitled to get some support from.
So it's trying to make sure that people don't fall through the gaps
Exactly.
that often happen. So they don't have to talk to multiple people across different and tell the same story all the time. It literally is around how we can connect care. So correct. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that's really important. And I think it sits within the landscape of other services too. So it's about the integrated care across other services. So we don't see ourselves as just the only service, we are across multiples. Fiona, you've had a lot of experience working with OPALS now. So, but I think, what was it really around the changing context of healthcare that you think influenced the emergence of, and probably the hopefulness that was surrounding the HJP being embedded in Queensland Health Metro South?
Thanks, Anne-Louise. So over recent years in the hospital context, we've certainly seen a trend towards more of a surge of chronic health and disability care. And that's because there is an increasing prevalence of chronic illness, complex health needs and disability in our society. So the latest figures show that there's about 38% of all Australians who live with at least one chronic illness. And that's often been associated with Australia's changing lifestyle, also the increasing prevalence of risk factors and Australia's ageing population. So as was discussed before, there is a strong and proven link between people's overall health and particularly chronic health conditions and their social factors. And so that's what is termed those social determinants of health. And those there are clear indicators that health is sensitive to a person's social environment, to factors such as income, education, living conditions, social support, and those factors act to either strengthen or undermine their health of the individual and also communities as well. So, for instance, what access does a person have to a healthy diet or health services? Do they have stable housing or access to transport to get to their appointments? Do they have adequate health literacy? Are they living in a safe, suitable or conditions, or do they have access to electricity and water? Do they have a safe place to store their medical equipment or their medications? And do they have the support they require, or if they don't, do they know how to access those supports? So there are a multitude of factors that of social factors that have a direct impact on a person's health and well-being, but also these factors have underlying legal implications associated with them. So what does that mean for social work in the hospital context? Given the relationship between a person's health, their social determinants and hospital presentations, hospital social workers are increasingly becoming a key contact point to address issues that patients are experiencing in their communities. Intrinsically, the hospital often becomes that one-stop shop to allow for people who have fallen through the cracks, as you mentioned before, or who have experienced barriers with accessing community supports to seek that help that they require. So hospital social workers are trained to unpack a patient's social situation and are becoming increasingly aware of the legal implications associated with this. And it's often evident to our social workers when working with patients that unmet legal need, for instance, around safety and housing and finances, can have an impact on health outcomes by either exacerbating or contributing to people's poor health. It's also been noted by hospital social workers that people who are feeling unsafe seek support or disclose concerns, and often for the first time when they're in hospital. And that's, you know, for example, in domestic and family violence cases and elder abuse cases. And often that's a time, it's because it's a time where the perpetrator isn't always present, but also because people feel safe in hospital, and they can also access support concurrently with accessing medical treatment, and sometimes under the guise of accessing medical treatment, so other people don't know that they're accessing our support. So social work and other hospital clinicians are becoming more adept at identifying red flags, thanks to TLA and some of the work that he's doing in the hospital. So identifying red flags for risk, and we as a hospital system do need to be able to respond to this in a sensitive, effective and timely way. We need to be able to seize on those opportunities when people are requesting help by having the appropriate supports available. And that's where that OPALS embedded model works so well at the PA, because it's visible, it's responsive and allows people to access legal supports in a sensitive and timely way without having to retell their story all the time. And that's often a source of stress for people when they do need to retell their story multiple times. And that's where that warm referral or that warm handover comes in well. So it also really importantly allows us to develop a safety plan, so concurrently with TLA for people, especially when TLA is looking at following people up in the community and providing support in the community to make sure that people are safe and able to access those supports.
And I think you mentioned the embedded model there as well. So do you want to just talk a little bit more about what the embedded model and how it's probably helped? I know that will probably segue across into our next question as well, but since I've got you, Fiona, I may as well ask you that.
Yeah, look, I think definitely having TLA as part of our broader team here helps in so many ways. Firstly, he's accessible, but also TLA's presence keeps topics such as elder abuse at the forefront of people's minds. TLA is able to develop his profile within the hospital system, and in so doing is able to access a broader population. As far as clinicians go, clinicians are starting to recognise him, and he's getting referrals from all sorts of referral sources. So, yeah.
Thanks, Fiona. And I think it's important, you know, you've really eloquently looked at the hospital perspective, but also too, this sits across the hospital and health service. So as we start to grow into around aged care and issues around, you know, aged care in the community, is hopefully aged care packages will increase in the future. Then also that ability to interface into the community and with our community health practitioners and our nurse navigators, etc. We're already seeing that with the referrals that are coming forward to TLA, but I think it's more about, you know, how we can grow across and that connected care. So And I think that segues really nicely into our next question, of really looking at, and this is open to all three of you. I might start with you, Tessa, with the larger perspective too. But how do HJPs, from your ideas, benefit legal and health services and ultimately our patients and clients?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and we have worked with practitioners across the country to develop a theory of change that really points to impacts at 4 levels. So at the individual level, in terms of the patients, the clients, the members of the community walking through your service doors, at the practitioner level, at the service level, and at the systemic level. And I think that's a really important part of thinking about why do you work in partnership. So for legal assistance services, the value in Health Justice Partnership is in reaching people with legal need who will not otherwise walk through the doors of a legal service. So thinking back to that very early evidence I was talking about, that people are unlikely to understand that these are problems with legal solutions, but they're likely to raise them in a healthcare setting. And so we're explicitly using the trust that people have in their healthcare services and providers to bring them access to a broader range of services. On the healthcare side, Health Justice Partnership really builds the capability of health services to respond to these multiple intersecting legal and social problems that often drive or exacerbate poor health in patients' lives. And we hear often from practitioners who are struggling with exactly this issue. It might be really clear to them that someone is talking to them about a chronic illness, but actually in the background there's a sense of a vulnerability at home, a safety issue, or a credit and debt issue. But healthcare practitioners don't necessarily have the tools that they need to address those problems. So the point is not to make health workers de facto lawyers. Through a Health Justice Partnership, we're adding legal help into the suite of disciplines that make for good, holistic, comprehensive healthcare. And I just wanted to give an example of what this can look like in terms of particularly the opportunity to sequence the responses of services. So if you take someone who's been evicted from their public housing without any notice, that's bread and butter for a community legal service, challenging a dodgy eviction. But if we're talking about someone who actually is being evicted because they've got an underlying mental health issue, they're starting to be deemed as an unsafe tenant, as destructive of property, there's actually a much more significant underlying health issue, and challenging a dodgy eviction isn't necessarily going to address that. Through a Health Justice Partnership model, you have the opportunity to sequence legal help so that we start by thinking about what the mental health needs are, we make sure that the person is getting the help that they need, access to medication or other sorts of services and support. And so at the point that we then pick up the tenancy issue, we're not just challenging a dodgy eviction, we're potentially securing someone's housing. So this opportunity of health and legal services to work together around complex problems is really about changing the outcomes that services can achieve for the clients and the patients that they're here to help.
I love that idea of sequencing. I think it's absolutely vital. I always see it like the other piece of the puzzle. We've often, tried to work out what do they have interventions? A lot of people have no idea that there is hope. There is an intervention potentially for the person. So yeah, I think that sequencing is a great idea. Tile, what do you think about health justice partnerships and the benefits for both sides as well as for our patients?
I just wanted to, piggyback on Tessa's comment around the way that we as community legal centres can target those clients who might not have access to traditional legal services, or even even consider that there's a legal pathway that's available or open to them. But I think more broadly as well, health justice partnerships, because of we're working in the intersection of health and justice, really does allow us some space, I suppose, to think through the bigger systemic issues. And I think, even within our health justice partnership and working alongside health practitioners, we've been able to identify within OPALS like little things that are happening or that we're noticing in the community or with older people, for example. Could be banking issues, or it could be to do with guardianship. One of the big things that we started working on at the start was around the elder abuse education, just because we noticed that there was no consistency around that across the hospital space and across Queensland Health. So really pushing and trying to agitate for that, for more uniform education around elder abuse and how to identify it. So those are, in terms of the big picture things, those are things that I know that health justice partnerships can work on. We our OPALS is funded by the Attorney General's Department, which I don't know if I said that earlier, but there are a couple of other services also funded under that same funding. And so we have a larger community of practice and network where we're also able to discuss those sort of bigger systemic issues that are happening interstate. And I think that, you know, on that broader level of, and that context around issues like powers of attorney and banking, there's potential for, you know, systems change or policy change. It's still early days for OPALS. Like, we've only been working for nearly, I think it's 2 years next week. So, you know, we're still in the early stages, but I think that there's a lot of power in the way that if we work well, and we might be able to have some benefit for the older community and the work that we're doing.
And you were saying before around the connection and commonalities, I suppose, around, you know, missions and what the roles of both the hospital and health service as well as the legal health justice partnership is, and also how that, from a larger systemic perspective, I think it's around helping the HJP also looks at supporting around things such as meeting compliance with our standards, our health standards, and also to, you know, how we learn to understand each other better. I used to sometimes go to meetings and, you know, lawyers would not really understand what was happening in the health space and vice versa. And this actually allows a dialogue to happen and a better understanding around the two, which I've seen start to really flourish. And, you know, that reaching out and that conversation that happens, which to me is, as a facilitator, is so pivotal, I think. But I think, you know, that's such an important aspect of this. And Fiona, I just wonder whether or not there's some, you know, things that you may have noticed. We can't be sure around, you know, the financial benefits of having the HJP on the ground for various reasons. But what have you noticed from a service perspective on the ground?
Yeah, so from the hospital, certainly, in regards to financial benefits, we are looking at reduced bed days, but also lowered risk of readmissions or presentations. So having the option to refer to OPALS now means that we have a safety net for people when they go home, and we can increase their protective factors. And that means then that we are able to move towards faster discharges, because we know that people are discharging to safer situations. So certainly shorter bed days is one benefit. And when people don't have the supports in place in community, they often present to hospital for minor or no medical need, and that's because the hospitals are seen as safety nets. So when we're able to optimise people when they have admissions and send them with those supports in place, the risk of readmission then is minimised. So certainly from a financial perspective for the hospitals, there are definite benefits that we can see. Great,
thank you. I just wanted to, and it probably segues into the next question, but from, and that may be a place for us to look at the concept of secondary consults, because you were talking about how it's building the confidence of staff to feel that they can, you know, discharge people safely and with supports into the community. So that really leads me to, you know, Tile and Tessa, to that conversation around, well, how is working with a health justice partner lawyer different to working with in-house legal counsel? And, you know, how do you differentiate the two and make them separate?
Shall I go first? Look, health justice partnership is about helping solve the legal problems in the lives of the people who are coming to healthcare services. So I think really important message here that this is not about legal needs arising from healthcare. I think that's a really important principle to understand. And so in some cases, the starting conversation between health and legal partners rules out options of looking at things like medical negligence, just takes it out of scope completely so that there's no confusion, so that it's really clear what we're here to do through this approach. Having said that, there are different approaches to this, and again, happy to unpack that further in questions or discussion. But at a general level, really critical to understand this is not about legal needs arising from healthcare. It's about the everyday problems in people's lives that affect their health and well-being, and the opportunity to tackle those through the trust that people have in their healthcare services.
And I think the only thing I would add to that, Tessa, is the benefit of having a lawyer who is independent of the hospital is just that it's that independence from the hospital system, which can be really vital to the advocacy work that we provide on behalf of our clients. And also we're almost a circuit breaker sometimes in terms of being able to view the patient's issues from a different perspective.
So your focus is totally really on what's the patient's needs and their decisions and supporting that. You're their advocate. Yeah.
Yes, correct.
Okay. And Hile, I don't think we've really explored in any detail about the type of, not only do you provide that direct support, but also there's those secondary consults. Do you want to talk to people a bit about what secondary consults are and how they've grown and the numbers even? Sometimes.
Sure. So secondary consults, and I'm sure Tessa can expand on this, but it's a common activity for a lot of health justice partnerships. But the way that we operate them is that it's a way for any health staff member, generally the social workers, to contact myself or the lawyer or the other lawyers in the OPALS team to have a de-identified hypothetical conversation with us. So it could be as simple as, I have Mrs. X here and she would like to make a power of attorney. Can she appoint her accountant? It could be really basic. It can be a 5-minute conversation, and then on the other end of the spectrum, it could be a bit of brainstorming to assist the health professional to sort of unpack or understand what the legal issues are, or what support we can do, or even whether that matter falls within the scope of OPALS or another legal service that we could refer them to. And so that's something that we offer as part of OPALS to all of the health professional staff that we work with. It's coming back to building the capacity for the health professional to understand legal issues, but I also use them as well as a way of understanding some of the health issues and how, if this patient has for example, Diogenes syndrome, how can I, use my legal expertise to support them? What should I understand about that illness, rather than just doing a Google search, for example, but having that relationship and building that relationship with the health professional.
Lovely. And I think you've been able to pick up all the acronyms that we use in Queensland Health really well. So, so I think that's the biggest hurdle people usually say when they come into our system. So I think that's a really useful, and I think too, no older person usually comes and says, I'm being abused, in terms of that, hello, I'm a victim of elder abuse. They don't necessarily think that what is happening to them, and that's fairly normal with most of the people. As we know with domestic and family violence, most people do not associate what's happening to them with actual abuse. So I think that's the ability of you to have conversations with people too, who may be staff members going, this is happening, I think it's abuse. Is it actually elder abuse, and can something be done? So that's the benefit as well. Thank you for that. Fiona, did you want to add anything extra to that one, or you feel comfortable that that one's been answered well enough at the moment?
No, I think it's been answered very well, but yeah, I just wanted to reaffirm that it's really confidence building for clinicians to be able to run things by TLA in a secondary consult and know that they have a plan together that will either optimise the person's situation or might be able to link them in with supports moving forward. So it is very affirming and confidence building for the clinicians.
Thanks.
I also just wanted to add, Anne-Louise, that I also remind, if they're saying, oh, how should I file this, or, that's not really a question that I can answer. I might offer an opinion every now and then, but it's very much, I say, that's something that you might have to talk to your hospital lawyer about, or, your team leader and line manager.
Yes, and that I think is really important, because, they're all the sorts of things that we need to consider when we start to even think about setting up a health justice partnership, but then also, what are the sorts of nuts and bolts things that need to be put into place to make sure that all partners and collaborators feel comfortable with the relationship. So Tessa, I suppose from your perspective, what are those sort of key things that people need to start to consider? Because there might be people online right now who are going, oh, this sounds like something we'd really like to explore. So what do we need to start to think about?
Well, I think it can be, when you have that aha moment, you understand what this is about and the value of it, it can be quite easy to race straight into thinking about partners and developing MOUs. But really, I think the most important starting conversation is, what are we trying to do? So the question about purpose, why are you interested in working with another service? What's the value of the partnership? Because, you know, as we've already heard from Fiona, and the evidence is really clear, we don't need to tell healthcare professionals that there are non-medical problems in their patients' lives. And equally, we don't need to tell community sector lawyers about the health and wellbeing impacts of legal problems. We need to understand what's the value of bringing that together. And so understanding the purpose in what we're trying to do is a critical starting point. And the reality, you know, in what we're seeing across the country now is, if you haven't identified at the start why you want to work together, even the most successful partnership can falter down the track. So it also becomes a false economy, really, to sort of race into an arrangement around working together without thinking through what's the value for the community that you're serving, for the practitioners and the service, and even for some of those big systemic issues that we've already heard about. So starting with purpose, and from there, how might you work together? And so I mentioned that there's a range of ways that we see these partnerships playing out. There are services where you've got lawyers on site days every week, they're on the hospital email system, the care team on the hospital think the lawyer is actually part of the same workforce, they don't know that they're employed by a legal centre down the road. But there are other examples where we're actually talking about a clinic or an outreach model, one day a week or one day a fortnight, and that reflects the capacity that's available. And there's no harm in that if you're really clear about what problems you're trying to solve and what's the way that you can best work together to solve them.
Yule, do you have any thoughts about what other things needed to be put into place?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good starting point, is understanding, you know, what is the purpose, why are we meeting? But I think for us as well in OPALS, and you would know this as well, Anne Louise, is who are we going to partner with? I think it was not just the sense of which hospital or which service, but who are, like in terms of elder abuse, who are our champions or our partners, and who would be the most, you know, people who would notice elder abuse in the hospital system and who would refer to us. And so it just seemed right with Metro South to work with the social work department, because they have access to that vulnerable cohort and client. They also have that inherent human rights-based scope in the way that they practice. And you know, as I said at the start, we also have that similar social work and lawyer integrated model at Caxton already. So it just seemed like a perfect fit for us. And I suppose everything flows from that. Once you know why and what and who and all those big questions, you can then determine what activities you'll do together. And so I've already talked about secondary consultations. Another big part of the work that OPALS does is around education, which I've also alluded to. So we provide elder abuse red flag training to Metro South Health staff. We also provide training about other topics, so like human rights and enduring documents and capacity and even advocacy. We do, you know, direct client engagement with clients through advices and casework. We have a steering committee that meets every now and then. We have a partnership integration team, which is basically all of anyone on the ground who has an interest in OPALS. We invite them to have a meeting with us regularly to talk about what issues and things that they're noticing, or if they want to bring a case study, we could unpack that. We also have a community of practices that I've mentioned as well. We have a lot of evaluation that we, you know, evaluating the service, and as part of our funding, there's a huge component of the work that we do, which is, you know, evaluating how well we are actually meeting the purpose of, you know, supporting the clients through elder abuse and responding to elder abuse. And so we do a lot of work. We have case studies that we have to write, client surveys, data collection about the profiles of our clients. We collect data about the secondary consultations that we do. And I suppose in terms of numbers, the one thing I might say about that is that we actually have more secondary consultations than actually client referral. So I think there's a lot of value in the secondary consultations in terms of providing information for health professionals to support their clients and to provide that information to their patients. We also do a lot of surveying, pre and post surveys for the red flags training that we do. Yeah, I could talk about a lot of things, Louise, so you can just stop me. I guess one thing that I probably will say is that for us at the outset of partnering, we also had to do a lot of thinking around information sharing and confidentiality, because that was really important as a community legal centre to make sure that, you know, for us, our clients, you know, right to legal professional privilege as it is protected, and also for the health side, for Metro South Health, to make sure that their patients had informed consent before being referred into our service and understood that they also had that right to confidentiality of their patient records and things like that. So we, as an independent service, we don't have access to any of their health records, only what we need to, you know, effect the referral and provide the support and information for that client.
And I think that's it until you, oh, sorry, Tessa, I was just going to say, yes, do you want to go first?
Well, I just wanted to pick up one other point about who we partner with, which is just that really critical thinking about the needs of the community that we're trying to address. And so in the same way that healthcare practitioners have a whole range of skill sets and expertise different from each other, lawyers are the same. And so it's really important then to think not just about who we're going to partner with at a service level, but what kinds of problems in the community we're trying to solve, what kinds of legal needs our clients, our community are likely to be experiencing, and who's the best fit for that. And so a good example of what that looks like is that if you're targeting, for instance, domestic and family violence, we already have a really good understanding of the stages in people's lives where they're likely to be particularly vulnerable to family violence: during pregnancy, during you know, post-antenatal period, during early life years of bub and mum. And so targeting family violence focused services for child and maternal health services, or for you know, for pregnancy focused services, is a really good fit for that model. But if you're working with a community that is likely to have a high level of immigration legal needs or employment or social security legal needs, you might need a slightly different kind of partnership. You might need different skills in the mix. So again, taking the time not just to think about the value of this partnership, but actually potentially to do some legal needs assessment, which is something that we're starting to do with services around the country, or to look at the evidence base around what kinds of problems are likely to be present in the community. Again, that will all really not just save you time in the long term, but really help shape the effectiveness of this collaboration.
Absolutely, Tessa. And I think that was one of the biggest things that we spent some time doing, was looking at the mapping, you know, who's in the community, what's the type of community. And, you know, we had some ideas about where we wanted to focus on as well. So, you know, how do we do that? Where do we start? The steering committee was absolutely vital there. I think, you know, being able to engage with everyone from consumers right through to executive, you know, having conversations about, well, you know, what's best for us to start at. And that's where we, you know, we got our beginning model titrated and best at the Princess Alexandra Hospital and surrounds. But then when we rolled out across the HHS, we then started to look at, well, what does it look like in those different hospitals? You know, the same thing with all the legal documentation then needed to be amended and supported. But, you know, they're the sorts of things that really, you know, you're thinking at strategic as well as practice level, as well as, you know, how best we can support clients. So it's a task that needs to be thoughtfully approached, but also shouldn't be seen as something so onerous that you can't do it, because there's been so many other people around who've done something similar. You know, I was aware of the St. Vincent's Hospital model, you know, down south. So that was the thing that initiated my interest and my focus. So I think we can all learn and benefit from each other and sort of collaborate and have conversations into the future around that. Now, I suppose, you know, we've all been talking at, you know, the higher level, but let's get down to the nitty gritty, I suppose, that often comes out from de-identified and, you know, constructed case studies, because that's really what, you know, a lot of the practitioners who may be listening would want to hear about. Is so Tile and Fiona, I'll look towards you to really start to think about and unpack an OPALS client story. And and what are the impacts for the clients, and what was OPALS and the social workers and others able to do?
Thanks, Anne-Louise. So this was a case that came from the PA and it has been de-identified. So the patient was a 72-year-old Aboriginal woman who was admitted to hospital under the renal team, and she undertakes home dialysis. She was referred to the renal social worker after raising concerns to the treating team about her discharge home. She disclosed to the social worker that her adult daughter had moved into her one-bedroom Department of Housing unit with her after her daughter's marriage broke down. Initially, this was on a temporary basis, but her daughter was now refusing to leave. She raised concerns that her daughter was drinking to excess, bringing people into the home that she didn't know, and on one occasion had become physically abusive towards her, and the neighbours were now starting to complain about the noise levels. She was also having to sleep in her living room in order to protect her dialysis equipment. The patient had contacted the Department of Housing and QPS for advice in the past, however, had not received the support that she was seeking. She had identified that she was wanting to know her rights with regards to exiting her daughter from her home. So the social work clinician had been to an OPALS education session and was able to identify that there were red flags of the red flags of elder abuse. The clinician contacted OPALS initially via a secondary consultation to ascertain if the case was within the scope of the OPALS service, and also to explore the possible options for the patient. And after discussing these options with the patient agreed that she would benefit from support to manage the situation and consented to an OPALS referral. The social worker and OPALS then conducted a joint session and safety planning with the patient prior to her discharge.
Thanks, Fiona. And I guess from there, I think we engaged with this client for over a period of 6 to 8 months. And obviously we provided culturally sensitive and appropriate legal advice to that client. She was really adamant that she didn't want to go through court. She didn't want to apply for a domestic violence order, saying, well, because she was Aboriginal, she didn't want to, think about the white fella way. She just wanted her daughter to leave. So we started off with the soft approach and wrote the daughter a letter asking her to leave. And she had initially agreed, but unfortunately, the last straw for our client was after she had given a bit of money to that daughter to help her pay for her bond, but she still wouldn't leave after the 2 months that we'd given her to leave. So she came back to us and said, look, it's not working. I'm really unhappy. And I think I will have to try and apply for a domestic violence order. And our community social worker continued to provide that emotional support. It was really important for this client that we built trust with her. So there was a lot of relationship building and trust building, just because she'd been fobbed off by other services before. And our social worker also, brainstormed options and prompted her self-advocacy skills and problem-solving skills. But in the end, I did apply. I drafted and wrote the application for this client to go to court, and I referred it to our DV duty lawyer service, and they appeared. A temporary protection order was made, which included an ouster order for the daughter to leave, and then the matter was adjourned, and the matter went back to court. Our DV duty lawyer appeared again, and a final order was made with the daughter actually consenting with our admissions to a final order, including the ouster condition, and so she left finally. And our social worker also supported her to have the house cleaned and to reorganize her home. She also had other legal issues. So, for example, she had an origin debt that we assisted her with to enter into a payment plan. She was really worried that her power was going to be cut off. So that was something that we were able to help her with as well. I think that the case really highlights the positive impact to our clients of our ability to pivot to the client's needs, and highlights the importance of our model to the client to be able to listen and to build trust, and I suppose not have the action bias to just jump in and go go get a DVO, but actually spend that time with the client to really understand, you know, what justice looked like for her, what that meant for her to engage in this process. I suppose our ultimate goal as in OPALS is that our clients feel supported and that our service can meet their needs. So I think for us in that case, it was successful. And I think of just reflecting that I think sadly, but probably meaningfully for the purpose of the work that OPALS does, the most common comment that I hear from clients after providing them with advice and after assisting them over a period of time is just their gratefulness at actually being listened to, being heard, and being understood. So I think that that's a really valuable thing for the clients that we work with. Fiona, from your point of view, did you have any other positive impacts that you wanted to talk about for that patient?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a really good example of somebody who is connected on a regular basis to the hospital. And from a hospital perspective, it's really lovely to see that these patients can have some progress in the community and can be optimised from a safety perspective, where previously they may not have been able to. And beyond that, it's just so important that they have access to a free service and a service that meets them where they're at. Beyond all of that, it's sometimes nice for the clinicians to hear the outcome of these stories and how things do progress for people in the community. We see people at sometimes their hardest points, and so to be able to hear some success stories is really important for us as well. So thanks, Tile.
And also, Tile, have you ever had times when you felt as though you've enabled a person to build their own capability, an older person?
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest positive impacts that we have, is that our clients are able to feel empowered to advocate for themselves. I actually had a recent case. A hospital social worker referred to me. It was a patient client who was at risk of financial elder abuse by her daughter. And I provided her with advice. I did title searches on her property just to, you know, get the status quo of what was happening. I provided her with advice, referred her to have an enduring power of attorney made with, you know, protective provisions within that power of attorney. And I also offered to support her at a discharge planning meeting or family conference, but she declined my assistance to attend that meeting. And the feedback I received from the social worker was in the family conference, she was very confident and able to assert her rights and set the appropriate boundaries with her daughter. And she kept saying, "Oh, my lawyer told me that you can't do that, and my lawyer advised me this." And it was a very positive outcome for that client. So I was really happy to hear that.
That felt very strong to be able to do that. So that's a testament to the work that you've done as well.
Yeah. And Louise, I just also wanted to add that I think one of the benefits for our client is just our flexibility to be able to meet them where they are. And I don't just mean in the hospital or, you know, at their home or a safe location or even, you know, in a COVID landscape, but I just mean practically. I think being in the way that we run our practice, as you know, is we have a human rights-based approach that centers the older person's voice. So we're often thinking about how to maximize the older person's participation in legal and non-legal processes that we're supporting them through. We're thinking about how can we help them to realize their right to safety while also ensuring their right to autonomy is protected. And as you know, we've had a couple of cases, or a few cases actually, where we've actually disagreed with the hospital when it's come to that issue of capacity. So for example, a hospital applied on where a hospital has applied to appoint a guardian or an administrator to protect an older person from elder abuse. In those kinds of cases, we have pushed back on behalf of the client and asked the hospital or the applicant, you know, is taking away the older person's right to make their decision the least restrictive option? You know, have they considered a domestic violence order or mediation? How did they know what was best for that patient in those circumstances? And both myself and our community social worker have appeared for clients in those kinds of cases at QCAT. And QCAT's actually found that the presumption of capacity, wasn't rebutted, and that there was no need to appoint a guardian or administrator, because in that time that takes to get to a hearing, between 1 to 3 months, we've actually been able to support the client to engage with the appropriate services or supports that they might already have in place to be able to make their own decisions. And so I just can't understate the impact and value for those clients in those circumstances, that their autonomy was safeguarded, because we've been able to ensure that they're not only safe from elder abuse from their, from family members, but also minimize their risk to systemic abuse.
Thank you, Chile. I think that's a really important point. Fiona or Tessa, do you have anything else that you want to add in this framework around, thinking around the benefits to clients in this area?
Well, just to respond to that comment from one of the participants in this webinar, really just to say there's so much value in this way of working, and there's a huge amount of information out there. So I've shared the link to our website and just really encourage people to get in touch if they're interested in hearing more. So I'll put my email contact in the chat, but I'd love to hear any questions from people, anything people have heard and want to unpack more or want to know more about, because I think we're really seeing the value and really interested in supporting health and legal services across Queensland to explore this opportunity for them.
Thank you, Tessa. And I think, just wrapping up the main part of the panel discussion, I suppose that's an absolutely vital and important thing for us to focus on. And we are very happy to have conversations and share and collaborate across, because I think, ultimately we're all here for the same thing. We're really around trying to help our clients to get the best. And sometimes it literally is around, I was reflecting on the case that you were talking about, Tile, sometimes it's literally because some of our health, services don't know that there are options for people. They don't know that there are things called ouster orders, or they don't know that there are, you have the ability to engage and support and assist people to make their own decisions. So it's a different type of dynamic now that's being opened up and explored, which is absolutely fantastic. So if anyone has some questions, I'm just having a look at the chat right now to see if there's anything happening. Otherwise, I suppose, were there any things about the model that you thought that might be relevant or useful for, and not just around the OPALS model, but Tess, you may even think of some other models that it might be useful for people to consider or to think about whether or not it might apply in their area?
Thanks, Anne-Louise. I think one thing to think about, particularly for a health consideration, is just this question about what does it mean to build the capability of your team, of your practitioners and service. And so I just wanted to give an example of what that can look like. I mean, Chile has talked about some of the training and some of the issue spotting work, and that's really a really core activity for Health Justice Partnership. But we've also seen, the examples, for instance, around family violence, where the healthcare system as a system has become really clear about this priority and has done a whole lot of great and really innovative work. So introducing screening tools, for instance, in antenatal services, family violence screening alongside some of the other more standard screening. But what we've seen often is that those screening tools often produce very low results. In fact, they're often ineffective. And when we've gone back and talked to practitioners about what's happening, it becomes clear that sometimes healthcare practitioners are screening out the experience of family violence. And they're doing it for really understandable reasons. So that might be that they feel ill-equipped to respond to the issue. They feel like it's an invasion of their patient's privacy, and they feel like it's fundamentally none of their business. But once you bring legal help into the holistic care model, once you have the discipline of legal assistance able to help healthcare practitioners understand what range of options are available to someone experiencing family violence, suddenly you change the capability to not just identify that problem in someone's life, but provide a response to it. And so there's a huge opportunity here in making better use of services that already exist if we can help them work better together. And that, I think, is the real promise of Health Justice Partnership. You see it here in the work of OPALS, you see it in elder review services around the country, we see it really significantly in responding to family violence and mental health. This is really about helping services work better together around complex problems in communities' lives.
I think that's a beautiful summary. And we do have a question. Are there any issues with conflict of interest from the legal service perspective?
I can field that one. So yeah, that's actually incorporated in our training that we provide to health professionals, but we still do our usual conflict check, the usual conflict check processes, and confirm whether we can see the patient or client before we see them. And if there is a conflict, then we provide other referral options for that patient to consider.
Pile, conflict check. Just a lot of people may not be aware of what that is. So what is a conflict check and why do you have to do it?
It's just, yeah, so it's to protect our clients, right, again, that legal professional privilege. So where we might have acted for a client, we just have to make sure that we, if we're accepting a referral, that we haven't, that person isn't named, isn't already a client or the other party in a matter that we're currently assisting with or previously assisted with.
Thank you. And I think that's probably an important point too, is that one of the things we noticed with OPALS, for example, and it's the same experience with most of the other health justice partnerships too, is that as you start to work together, you realise, in fact, that there's more that needs to be developed. So more resources or more conversations. I know right at the beginning, it was even around, well, how do we introduce a health justice partnership concept, from a practitioner perspective to a client? How do we do it in a way that's appropriate without looking as though we're trying to sell a service? Those sorts of conversations. So we ended up, developing up words for people so that they could have that. And we ended up becoming great marketers because, we walked around the hospital and handed out flyers and then went to the community. But there's so many things to look at developing. And as that collaboration grows, I think that's the beauty of health justice partnerships, is that, I feel so proud to have seen the OPALS program grow in Metro South, because, Pile, basically, people are contacting you now, whenever. They know you, they can call you. It's not just the social workers, nurse navigators in the community, other people in the community. There's so much that's, and other hospitals, and, we're now being involved in so many more different types of education too. So it becomes a larger resource, I think, to the health system, but then also grows your capacity, your capability, and also our focus on the patients themselves. And I think, Tessa, from the larger perspective nationally, I think it's such a wonderful thing to hear about the different types of health justice partnerships that are growing across the board. And it'll just be wonderful to hear how they grow into the future. So if we haven't got any more questions, and I can't see any extras in the chat, is there anything else that our panel want to make? Any other comments before we sign off and say thank you to everyone for attending? But I want to thank you, the panel, Tessa, Pile and Fiona, for the time that you've given to this, and hopefully for the amount of knowledge that you've imparted, and for practicing in this area. It's fantastic. Thank you all. And thank you all for watching today. Thank you. Bye.